Now, does this little plant hold the secret to curing your lungs? Or is it just a load of medieval hogwash superstition? Lungwort is called lungwort because of an old belief that it cures lung conditions. Its Latin name is Pulmonaria, with pulmo meaning lung. It is said the spotted leaves resemble diseased lungs, which has led to its naming and use in traditional herbal medicine. So this is an example of a very superficial correspondence at work in medical herbal knowledge. But it really isn't all as simple as that. You see, lungwort is one of the plant's higher mucilage. So when you submerge the hairy leaves in water, you can feel a slippery substance coating the surface of the leaf. This is the mucilage. Now, a much deeper correspondence is to associate a dry cough or a raspy throat with a need for a cooling and slippery medicinal substance, which is what you get with lungwort. Now, lungwort may not be as effective as other high mucilage herbs in soothing respiratory conditions such as mullein, slippery elm or violet, for example. It is also mildly toxic, unlike the other plants mentioned, but it has acquired these two levels of correspondences which come to fix its relationship with the lungs quite deeply in our imaginations. So for centuries, people believed that healing plants would look like the body parts that they were meant to heal. So this very old idea is underpinned by the Doctrine of Signatures. So this is a theory which emerged out of the 16th century and has been adversely shaping the reputation of herbal medicine and plant knowledge ever since. But was it just wishful thinking, or was it actually a way of confirming or validating pre-existing medical and herbal knowledge? Now, the problem is that the Doctrine of Signatures has now become synonymous with medieval medical ignorance. This is quite typical of the way that we tend to view the past in a negative light, as if before the advent of science and the scientific method, that nothing especially truthful or useful could come to light. We tend not to trust or find value in epistemology or thought or belief systems that came about before the advent of modern science. The Doctrine of Signatures is a now outdated theory that was put forward by Jacob Baumer, a 16th and 17th century German mystic, Christian mystic and philosopher, who stated in his theory that God had left a knowable signature on all things and objects in nature that were intended for the good of mankind. Baumer didn't invent this idea. Rather, it doesn't diverge much from the correspondence style of thinking that had been informing medical knowledge since the time of the ancient Greek and Arabic physicians, who all pretty much took it for granted that healing plants gave visual clues as to their healing properties. So in practice, it sounds something like this. Oh look, a walnut looks like a brain. It must be good for healing brain conditions. Lungwort, it has spotted leaves. The leaves resemble diseased lung tissue. Therefore, it must be good for curing lung conditions. Oh, this little flower here looks like it has an eye in the middle and it's very bright. Let's call it eye bright and use it for curing eye diseases. To anyone living today, this must sound quite naive or as wishful thinking, like, oh yes, wouldn't it be nice if the world was that simple and reality was that simple to understand? Now, those who advanced this belief and thought in correspondences were often the brightest medical thinkers and natural philosophers of their age, many of whom made discoveries which really advanced modern science, and we really wouldn't be where we are today without them. Would it be fair to label them as naive or gullible or misguided, as we do tend to? One of those important medical thinkers was Paracelsus, the Swiss physician who was working in the 16th century. He's now known as the father of chemistry and toxicology. He was a hermeticist, and he strongly argued that nature marked its cures and made their uses known to us. Maybe this doctrine and this way of thinking in correspondences wasn't a simple or lazy way of pointing out herbal uses. Perhaps it was a way of remembering and confirming plants and remedies based on pre-existing knowledge, even though it may have been misguided in certain contexts, especially I'm thinking like a Christian religious context. This idea that like affects like, or thinking in correspondences, has very ancient roots and flows throughout the history of science and is found in the work of Aristotle and Dioscorides and Galen. Thinking in correspondences is really interesting, so it's intrinsic to the way that the human mind operates. It wields very powerful results and will always play a role in how we understand and interpret the world around us, and also how we create new knowledge. Here are two fascinating examples. Now, the first one is the Western discovery of quinine, the malaria drug. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had just known that the bitter taste of the cinchona bark would treat malaria. The second one is the shape of molecules and drug design. So scientists use molecular docking, which is a principle that very much mirrors the doctrine of signatures. In pharmaceutical research, a drug is effective when its molecular shape corresponds with the receptor that it binds to, and they fit together like a lock and key. This is very much correspondence in action. Ancient and medieval healers tended to use plants based on experience and also on instinct and wisdom, collective wisdom. Of course, many of the plants didn't work, and quite often harmful remedies and medical treatments could be promoted and administered for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, because they were being propped up by dogmatic and erroneous beliefs and principles. But it wasn't all just random guessing and ignorance. Many of these herbs had been used for centuries, and the doctrine may have just been another way of justifying their uses and remembering the remedies and the plants, very much in line with ancient epistemologies and ways of remembering. Of course, this is in a pre-scientific time when herb knowledge was still very much tied to religious belief and symbolism and story and allegory. It is worth trying to understand herb lore and practices and traditional methods within the context of those pre-scientific knowledge systems from where they arose. Now, if we are being hardline skeptical, then we could just argue that the Doctrine of Signatures is just another form of confirmation bias. This is to make false assumptions about the relationship between phenomena without testing or verifying it. Just because a walnut looks like a brain doesn't mean that it will be good for the brain. But in fact, walnuts are actually very high in omega-3, which does make them good for the brain. But then again, so is rosemary and sage and ginseng, but they don't look like the brain. See, here's where it gets interesting and confusing. Many of these plants, which do resemble things, do actually contain beneficial properties to treat the thing that it resembles. Lungwort with its spotted leaves, I don't necessarily think this looks like a lung condition, not one that I've seen, but I'm not a doctor. But it contains high levels of mucilage, and it has been used for many centuries. The famous bold eye salve, so this is an ancient early medieval eye formula which has been recreated in a laboratory and proven to actually kill MRSA antibiotic resistant bacteria. Always when we are tempted to look back at medieval medicine as primitive, we should stop and question and just ask ourselves, like, are we being too quick to dismiss it here? And what can we learn from understanding the knowledge system from which this arose? So science is always evolving, and even pre-scientific medical knowledge and plant law is very much part of our story too. If you think of it this way, like what we once thought was superstition, science can prove that it actually has some factual merit. And I believe it can actually go the other way as well. So scientific truths that we now hold today about the cosmos and about the way reality works, within a few years' time can be completely turned on its head and can look fairly primitive in quite a short length of time. So ancient medical knowledge didn't operate like modern science, but it wasn't random either. It was built on trial and error, passed down through generations, and sometimes the theories like the Doctrine of Signatures could just have been another way to try and organize and encode and remember all that knowledge. Before we laugh at what knowledge was passed down from the past, maybe we should ask ourselves, like, what scientific truths or realities that we hold dear today could seem quite ridiculous, in say 100, 200 years time, or even sooner. So what do you think? Was the Doctrine of Signatures just a silly idea that should be consigned to the dustbins of history, or do you agree that it was just one of many ways throughout the ages of trying to preserve old knowledge? If you're interested in this topic, then let me know in the comments, because I'll be happy to hear from you.